There are places on this planet that simply don't make sense. Walls built from stone so large they shouldn't have been moved. Cities hidden deep beneath the ground, designed to keep something out. Ancient objects that seem to work in ways no one expected. And maps that show parts of the world long before they were ever discovered. Across deserts, mountains, and buried beneath centuries of time, we keep uncovering pieces of something that doesn't fit. These aren't stories. They're real. Documented by archaeologists, studied by scientists, measured, tested, and still not fully explained. If that kind of mystery pulls you in, you're not alone. Comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Settle in. In Antarctica, at the edge of a collapsing ice shelf, something like that happened. Not during an expedition for discovery, not during a search, just routine work, climate research, ice measurements, data collection, nothing unusual. Until the ice moved. Not all at once, just enough. A fracture, a shift. A section breaking away into the ocean, and beneath it, something appeared, rock. Dark, ancient. Exposed for the first time in millions of years. At first it meant nothing, just another data point, evidence of warming, a place to take samples. But then someone noticed it. Not immediately, not clearly, just something off. A pattern, lines in the ground, shallow, repeating. At first it looked natural. The kind of thing you ignore. Until you don't. Because when you stop and really look at it, it changes. They weren't random, they were aligned, evenly spaced. And then came the realization. They look like footprints. Not perfect, not clean, but close enough. Too close. And that's where everything stops making sense, because footprints shouldn't exist there. That ground has been buried under ice for tens of millions of years, before humans, before anything like us, so whatever made those impressions shouldn't exist. And yet, they do. Not one. Not two. A sequence. A trackway. Moving across the exposed rock in a straight line. As if something walked there. That's not interpretation. That's observation. And here's where it gets worse. The spacing between each impression is consistent, measured, balanced like steps. Erosion doesn't do that. Nature doesn't organize itself like that. At least, not like this. So the team documented everything. Photos, depth scans, measurements. Because this wasn't just unusual, it was a problem. But there's a problem with the problem. Footprints require soft ground, pressure, movement, and then time. They need to harden, to be preserved, to survive, which means these were made when the ground wasn't frozen, when Antarctica was different, and that part is true. Millions of years ago, Antarctica wasn't ice. It was green, forests, rivers, life, but not human life, not even close. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If these are footprints, what made them? The official answer came quickly. They aren't footprints. They're erosion. Patterns formed by melting ice, shifting sediment. Freeze-thaw cycles. And that explanation works, at first, because nature can create strange shapes, it can mimic structure, create patterns, trick the eye. But then you look again, and it stops working. Because these impressions show something else. Structure, a heel, an arch, forward extensions that look like toes. And then there's the stride, each one placed at the same distance. Step, after step, after step. That's not random, that's movement. And then something else appears, something harder to explain. One print, on top of another, an overlapping impression, two moments, captured together, in the same layer of rock, not separated by millions of years, but existing at the same time. And that changes everything, because now it's not just a shape, it's an event. Something happened there, something moved, and left a mark. Researchers tried to match it. Dinosaurs, reptiles, early mammals. Some tracks come close, but not close enough, because these lack claws, no talons, no drag marks, just smooth pressure, like a foot. And this isn't isolated. In Texas, human-like footprints appear beside dinosaur tracks. In Utah, a trilobite fossil seems crushed beneath something shaped like a shoe. In Nevada, massive footprints are embedded in ancient rock. Different places, different time periods. Same problem. They don't fit. Most are dismissed, some are fake, some are mistakes, but not all. Because every now and then, one remains, clear enough, precise enough, to stay and to raise a question that doesn't go away. What if our timeline is incomplete? Not wrong, just missing something. What if life on Earth didn't move forward, but repeated? Rise, fall, disappear, and begin again. Civilizations before history. Species before memory. Leaving behind fragments, marks in stone, or something else. Something harder to accept. What if time itself isn't linear? What if past, present, and future exist together, layered, and under the right conditions? They overlap, moments touching, imprints transferring. It sounds impossible, but so do footprints in Antarctic rock. Others suggest something different, that the Earth records events, like memory, that under pressure, stone doesn't just form, it remembers. Movement, weight, presence, captured, stored. And what we're seeing is not a footprint, but a trace, an echo from somewhere else, or some other time. Or maybe it's simpler than all of this. Maybe it's just nature, a rare pattern, a coincidence, something that looks intentional, but isn't. But even that explanation has a problem. Because when you stand there, at the edge of that ice, looking at those impressions, it doesn't feel random. It feels placed. And then the ice returns. Snow covers the rock. Wind reshapes the surface. The patterns begin to fade. Some already gone, lost again, buried beneath the same ice that hid them for millions of years. And maybe that's the point. Because Antarctica doesn't reveal its secrets. It hides them, preserves them, waits. And when it finally shows something, it doesn't explain. It just lets you see it. For a moment. Just long enough to realize something doesn't add up. Somewhere beneath the ice, there may be more. More tracks. More patterns. More pieces of something we don't understand. Or something we're not meant to understand. Because sometimes, the Earth doesn't just hold history. Sometimes, it remembers things we were never meant to know. And every now and then, when the ice pulls back just enough, it shows you a fragment. Not to answer questions, but to make sure you keep asking them. The stone that rings like metal. There are places where sound behaves in ways it shouldn't. Not echoes, not illusions. Real sound. Produced by something that, according to everything we know, shouldn't be capable of producing it. In Pennsylvania, inside a quiet wooded area known as Ringing Rocks Park, there is a field of stones that does exactly that. At first, nothing about the place feels unusual. It looks like any other rocky landscape. Large boulders scattered across the ground, uneven surfaces, weathered edges. Nothing that immediately stands out. Visitors walk through it every day without realizing what they're standing on, until someone picks up a hammer and strikes the rock. The sound is not what you expect. It doesn't sound like stone. It doesn't sound dull or flat or muted. It rings, clear, metallic, almost like hitting a bell. And then another rock is struck, and another. And suddenly the entire field comes alive with sound. At first it feels like a trick. Maybe the rocks are hollow. Maybe there's metal inside. Maybe it's just the way the sound echoes across the surface. But then you notice something strange. Not all of the rocks ring. Some produce that clear bell-like tone. Others don't. They sit right next to each other, same size, same shape, same environment. Yet one rings. The other stays silent. And that's where things begin to get difficult to explain. Because if this were simply about material, they should all behave the same way. If it were hollow space, it should be consistent. If it were external conditions, the sound should carry across all of them, but it doesn't. Researchers studied the site, trying to understand what causes the sound. The rocks are identified as a type of diabase, a dense volcanic stone formed millions of years ago. Under normal circumstances, this kind of rock does not produce musical tones. And yet, here, it does. One explanation suggests internal stress. Over time, as the rock cooled and cracked, tension built up inside certain stones. When struck, that tension vibrates, producing sound in a way similar to metal. It's a reasonable theory, but it doesn't explain everything, because the pattern is inconsistent. Some rocks ring clearly, others, just inches away, produce nothing. Even more strangely, some rocks that once rang stop, and others that were silent begin to produce sound. That shouldn't happen. Stone doesn't just change its acoustic properties randomly. At least it's not supposed to. Visitors have tried experimenting, striking different areas, using different tools, applying different amounts of force. Sometimes the sound changes, sometimes it disappears entirely, and sometimes it becomes louder, almost like the rock is responding. There's another detail that makes the site even more unusual. When multiple rocks are struck in sequence, they don't just make noise, they create tones, different pitches, different frequencies, almost like a natural instrument. Some have even described it as a kind of stone music. Unintentional, uncontrolled, but structured. And that raises a question. Is this just a geological accident? Or something more precise? Because across history, humans have created instruments out of stone before. Lithophones. Carefully shaped rocks designed to produce musical notes when struck. They exist in different parts of the world, from ancient Asia to Africa. But those were carved, designed, tested. These are not. These stones were never shaped by human hands. They were formed naturally, and yet somehow they behave like instruments, which leads to an unsettling thought. What if this isn't random? Some researchers suggest that the entire field may have formed under very specific conditions. A combination of cooling patterns, mineral composition, and environmental stress that created stones capable of resonance. Rare, but possible. But even that explanation has limits, because it doesn't explain why the effect is so localized, why only certain rocks ring, why the behavior changes over time. And then there's something else, something that isn't often discussed. The arrangement. The rocks are not evenly distributed. They cluster, forming a kind of natural field, dense in some areas, sparse in others. And within that field, the ringing stones are scattered in a way that almost feels selective. Not random, it's subtle. But once you notice it, it's difficult to ignore. Almost like the sound isn't just a property, but a pattern. Of course, there are grounded explanations. Natural fracture lines, variations in density, differences in internal stress. All of these can affect how a rock vibrates when struck. And most scientists agree that this is likely the case. That the phenomenon, while unusual, is still natural. But that doesn't make it any less strange, because even if the explanation is correct, it doesn't remove the experience. Standing there, in the middle of that field, striking a stone, and hearing something that doesn't sound like stone, a clear metallic tone, resonating longer than it should, carrying across the air in a way that feels intentional. And then the thought appears. Why does it sound like that? Not just how, but why. Because nature rarely creates something that feels this precise without reason. And then there's one more detail. When you stop hitting the rocks, the sound lingers, not physically, but mentally. Because once you've heard it, it changes how you see the place. It's no longer just a field of stones. It's something else. A system. A structure. Something that behaves in a way we don't fully understand. And maybe the answer is simple. Just physics. Just geology. just a rare combination of natural factors creating an unusual effect. But even then, it leaves a question behind. Because if stone can ring like metal, if something so solid, so lifeless, can produce something so clear and structured, then what else is it capable of? And what else have we walked past without ever realizing what it could do? Because sometimes the strangest things aren't hidden. They're right in front of us, waiting for the moment someone decides to strike them. And listen, stone walls built without mortar. High above Cusco, the stone walls don't behave the way they should. At first glance, they look like defensive structures, massive terraces built along the hillside forming a fortress overlooking the valley. But the closer you get, the harder it becomes to understand what you're looking at. The walls aren't straight. They don't follow simple lines or predictable patterns. Instead, they move in sharp angles, forming a zigzag structure that stretches across the landscape. And each section is made from stone so large they don't seem practical to move, let alone place with precision. Some of these blocks weigh over 100 tons. And yet, they are positioned with exact alignment. No gaps, no instability, no visible support, and there is no mortar, nothing binding the stones together, no cement, no filler, no hidden structure holding them in place, just stone against stone. And somehow, they hold, even after centuries, even after earthquakes. That's where things start to shift. Because this region isn't stable. The Andes experience constant seismic activity. Modern buildings crack, walls collapse, structures fail under pressure, but these walls don't. They move slightly during earthquakes, adjust, then settle back into position. That's not how rigid structures behave. Rigid structures break, flexible structures survive, and somehow these walls do both. The reason begins with the shape of the stones. They aren't uniform, not square, not rectangular. Each one is carved into a complex polygon, with multiple sides fitting perfectly into the stones around it. Every edge is intentional. Every angle serves a purpose. They don't just sit next to each other, they interlock. You can run your hand across the surface and feel no separation. The contact is so precise that even thin objects can't pass between the stones. That level of accuracy isn't just surface work. It means that internal contact points are equally precise. The weight is distributed, balanced, controlled. And that raises a problem, because this level of stonework is extremely difficult to achieve, even today. Modern engineers can replicate the appearance, but doing it at this scale, with this level of consistency, without advanced tools, becomes a different challenge entirely. And according to historical understanding, the Inca didn't have those tools. No iron, no steel, no powered machinery. So how was it done? The standard explanation is time and skill. Stone shaped using harder rocks, hammering, grinding, slowly refining each surface until it matched perfectly with the surrounding stones. It would have taken years, maybe decades, careful placement, constant adjustment, and it's possible. But there are details that don't fully align with that idea. Some of the stones show surfaces that don't look hammered. They look smooth, curved in ways that are difficult to produce, with simple tools, almost as if the stone was shaped in a different state. Not broken, not chipped, but formed. There are theories about this, unconfirmed but persistent. Some suggest the use of natural compounds that could temporarily soften stone. Others believe the shaping techniques used by the builders have simply been lost over time. There is no clear evidence for either. But the question remains, because the precision doesn't feel accidental. And then there's the problem of movement, because shaping the stone is only one part, transporting it is another. These blocks were moved from quarries located kilometers away, across uneven terrain, without wheels, without metal tools. The explanation is manpower. Hundreds of workers, ropes, logs, levers. Slow, controlled movement over time. Again, possible. But when you stand in front of those walls, looking at stones larger than vehicles, fitted together with exact precision, the explanation begins to feel incomplete, and then something else appears. The construction isn't consistent. Different sections of the site show different styles, different techniques. Some stones are massive and highly complex, others smaller, but equally precise, which suggests something important. The walls may not have been built in a single phase. Some researchers believe parts of Sacsayhuaman may be older than the Inca themselves, that the Inca expanded the site, built over something that already existed. There's no definitive proof, but the variation is there, and it's difficult to ignore, because if the same civilization built everything, why does the method change? And if they didn't, who did? Similar stonework appears in other parts of the world. Polygonal walls, massive stones, no mortar, perfect alignment. Different cultures, different continents, same result. That shouldn't happen easily, unless the knowledge was shared, or inherited, or rediscovered, or something else. Of course, there is always the simplest explanation, that human skill, given enough time, can achieve things that seem impossible, that patience and precision are enough. And maybe they are, but even then, something about these walls remains unsettled, because they don't just stand, they hold. Against time, against movement, against forces that should have broken them apart. And they do it without anything binding them together, except themselves. And maybe that's the real question, not how they were built, but how they continue to remain. The door that cannot be opened. Along the mountain paths near Machu Picchu, there are places where the rock itself has been shaped with intention, not into walls, not into terraces, but into something more specific. A doorway. At first it looks incomplete. A rectangular frame carved directly into solid stone, standing upright as if it once led somewhere. The edges are clean. The proportions are deliberate. It has all the features of an entrance. Except for one thing. It doesn't open. There is no chamber behind it, no passage, no structure connected to it, just a rock. And yet, it was carved as a door. This is one of several so-called false doors found across Inca sites in Peru. Structures that resemble entrances but lead nowhere. Cut into cliffs, boulders, and mountainsides with the same precision used in functional architecture. At Machu Picchu, the example is subtle, easy to overlook, until you stop and really look at it, because nothing about it feels accidental. The frame is symmetrical, the edges are straight, the corners are defined, even the slight inward angle of the sides matches the trapezoidal design seen in real Inca doorways. It follows the same rules, which raises the first question. Why build a door that cannot be used? The immediate explanation is symbolic. In many ancient cultures, doorways represented more than physical entry. They marked transitions, boundaries between spaces, between states, between the visible and the unseen. A door didn't always have to open. Sometimes it only needed to exist. Among the Inca, architecture often carried spiritual meaning. Mountains were sacred. Stones were not just materials, but part of the landscape's identity. Carving a doorway into rock could have been a way of marking a connection between the human world and something beyond it. A threshold. But if that's the case, why make it look so functional? Because this isn't an abstract symbol. It's not decorative. It's precise, built with the same care as structures meant to be used. And that creates a contradiction, because symbolic objects are usually simplified, representational. This is not. This is exact, and then there's the placement. The doorway isn't located in a central ceremonial space. It's not part of a larger temple complex. It's positioned along a natural rock face, integrated into the landscape itself. Not hidden, but not emphasized either, almost as if it wasn't meant to be noticed immediately, only recognized. There are other examples. Across Peru, similar false doors appear in different locations. Some carved into cliffs, others into isolated stone formations. All sharing the same basic structure, all leading nowhere, and all raising the same question. What were they for? One theory suggests ritual use, that these doorways were not meant to be entered physically, but spiritually. portals in a symbolic sense, places where ceremonies were performed marking transitions between life and death, or between the material and the sacred. In that interpretation, the doorway doesn't need to open because it isn't meant for the body, only for meaning. But then there are details that complicate that idea, because some of these doorways show signs of additional shaping, small niches carved nearby, subtle features that suggest interaction, not just observation, as if something was placed there, or done there. And then there's the question of effort. Carving into solid rock at that level of precision is not simple. It requires time, skill, planning. So why invest that effort into something that serves no direct function? Unless the function is something we don't recognize. Another possibility is that these structures were unfinished, abandoned mid-construction, part of a larger design that was never completed. But that explanation doesn't fully hold, because the doorway itself is complete. The frame is finished. The proportions are correct. There are no rough edges suggesting it was left halfway. It was brought to completion. And then it stops, exactly at the point where it would become functional. That feels intentional. There's also a more structural theory. Some researchers suggest that these carved frames may have been used for alignment, markers within the landscape, points that correspond with astronomical events or natural features. In that case, the doorway isn't about entry, it's about position. But again, the design feels too specific for that alone, because alignment markers don't need to resemble doors. They just need to indicate direction. This does more than that. It imitates access, and then removes it, which brings the focus back to the idea of a threshold, a boundary that exists but cannot be crossed. That concept appears in multiple cultures, the idea of a doorway between worlds, a passage that is visible but not accessible. In some traditions, these are symbolic of death, in others, of transformation, in others still, of knowledge that cannot be reached directly. And here, carved into the stone of a mountain, that idea takes physical form, a door that leads nowhere, or somewhere we can't reach. And then there's one more detail. Standing in front of it, you feel something. Not physical, not measurable, but noticeable. Because the mind reacts to it. It recognizes the shape, understands what it's supposed to be, and then encounters the contradiction. A door that cannot open. And that contradiction stays, because it doesn't resolve, it just exists. And maybe that's the point, because not everything built in the past was meant to be used. Some things were meant to be understood, or questioned, or remembered, and this may be one of them. Because long after the people who carved it are gone, the doorway remains, still, standing, still precise, still closed, not because it was sealed, but because it was never meant to open. The ancient observatory towers. In the coastal desert of northern Peru, where the land stretches dry and silent toward the horizon, a line of stone towers stands along the ridge of a low hill. From a distance, they don't look unusual, just ruins, broken walls, fragments of something abandoned. But then you notice the pattern. The towers are not scattered. They are aligned. 13 of them, equally spaced, running in a straight line across the ridge. And that's where the question begins. Because structures like this are rarely built without purpose. And this arrangement feels intentional. At first, archaeologists believed it might be a defensive structure, a kind of fortification overlooking the surrounding desert. But that explanation didn't hold for long. The towers are too evenly spaced, too exposed, and they don't form a wall. They form a line, which means they weren't built to stop something. They were built to mark something, and that realization changes everything. Because when you stand at a specific point west of the ridge, the towers begin to behave differently. The sun rises, and one by one, the towers catch the light. Not randomly, in sequence, at different times of the year. On one day, the sun rises directly behind the first tower. On another, it aligns with the second, then the third, and so on, until over the course of a year the entire line is used, each tower marking a specific position of the sun along the horizon. A calendar, not carved in stone, but built into the landscape itself. And suddenly the purpose becomes clear. This is not a fortress, it's an observatory, one of the oldest known solar observatories in the world, dating back more than 2,300 years. Long before modern astronomy, long before telescopes. And yet, it works, with precision, because from the correct observation point, the alignment is exact. The towers track the movement of the sun across the year, solstices, equinoxes, seasonal shifts, all of it visible, all of it predictable, and all of it built into 13 simple stone structures. But that's where things become more complex, because understanding the sun's movement like this requires observation, long-term observation, years, possibly generations, tracking the horizon, recording positions, recognizing patterns, and then translating that knowledge into architecture. That's not simple. That's not accidental. That's intention. And it raises a question. Who built this? The site is often associated with the Khazma Sechin culture, a civilization that existed in the region before the rise of the Inca. But very little is known about them. No written records, no clear explanation of their systems. Only structures. And this is one of the most precise they left behind, which suggests something important. They understood the sky. Not in a general sense, but in detail. Enough to build a functioning solar calendar using fixed points in the landscape. And then there's something else. There are 2 observation points, one to the west, one to the east. From each side, the towers align differently with the rising and setting sun, which means the system isn't limited. It's complete. It tracks the full movement of the sun across the horizon, from both directions. That level of design doesn't happen by chance. It requires planning, symmetry, understanding. And yet, the towers themselves are simple. Rough stone, basic construction. No decoration, no complexity in their individual form. All of the complexity is in the arrangement, in the positioning, in the relationship between them, which makes the entire site feel less like a structure and more like a system, a machine, built out of stone and powered by the movement of the sun. But then there's a detail that shifts the perspective again. The site also includes a fortified structure nearby, walls, enclosures, evidence of conflict, which suggests that this place wasn't just observed. It was protected. And that raises another question. Why protect an observatory? Because observing the sky is one thing, but controlling time is something else. Calendars determine seasons, seasons determine agriculture, food, survival, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare. That knowledge is power, and places that hold that knowledge become important, worth defending. But even with all of this understood, there's still something about Chenkyo that feels different. Because it doesn't just measure time. It makes time visible. Standing there, watching the sun rise behind the towers, you don't need instruments, you don't need calculations, you can see it. The movement, the change, the passage of days becoming months, encoded in stone. And that creates a strange realization. Because this wasn't built for observation alone, it was built for understanding. To make something invisible, visible. And that idea appears in other places. Across the world, ancient cultures built structures aligned with the sky. Stone circles, temples, monuments, all tracking movement above. Different methods, different designs, same intention, to connect the ground with the sky. And here, in the desert of Peru, that connection takes the form of 13 towers on a ridge. Simple, precise, unmistakable. and still working. Because even now, thousands of years later, the sun still rises, and the towers still align, exactly as they were meant to. And maybe that's the most important part. Because whatever knowledge built this was accurate enough to outlast the people who created it, and remain unchanged, marking time without needing to be understood. The giant stone heads. In the lowland jungles of southern Mexico, massive faces emerge from the ground. Not carved into cliffs, not part of walls, but separate, independent, placed. At first, they don't look real. The proportions feel too deliberate, too controlled, as if they belong to something modern, but they don't. These are the Olmec colossal heads, carved from solid basalt. Some weighing over 20 tons, and they are not small. Each one stands several meters high, distinct features, broad noses, full lips, eyes set deep beneath heavy brows. No two are identical. That's the first detail that matters, because these are not generic sculptures. They are individual faces, which suggests something important. They represent specific people, leaders, rulers, or figures of importance. But then the question shifts, because carving a face is one thing, moving it is another. These stones did not originate where they now stand. The basalt used to create them comes from quarries located up to 80 kilometers away, through dense jungle, across rivers, over uneven terrain, without wheels, without metal tools. That shouldn't be easy. And yet, they were moved. The common explanation is manpower. Large groups of workers, using logs, ropes, levers, slow movement, careful coordination. And it's possible. But the scale changes things, because these are not small objects. They are massive, heavy enough that even slight miscalculations would make movement impossible. And then there's the terrain. Jungle doesn't offer smooth paths. It resists movement, and yet these stones were transported, not once, but multiple times, because there isn't just one head. There are many, discovered, across different sites, all sharing the same core features, but each one unique, which suggests a system, a tradition, a repeated process. And that leads to another question. How were they carved? Basalt is not soft. It's dense, hard, difficult to shape even with modern tools. And yet, the details are precise. Smooth surfaces, defined features, subtle variations in expression. That requires control. Not just effort, understanding, technique. The official explanation is again simple. Stone tools, hammering, grinding, time, a lot of time. And that works. But then there are the details. Some surfaces appear too smooth, too consistent, as if the shaping process wasn't purely impact-based. And then there's the symmetry. Not perfect, but intentional, balanced, which is difficult to achieve when working with hard stone using only basic tools, and yet it was done. But here's where things begin to shift again, because these heads were not just created. Some of them were moved again, repositioned, buried, re-exposed, as if their placement changed over time, which suggests they were not static monuments. They had a function, a purpose beyond decoration. And then there's something else. The expressions? They are not neutral. Each face carries something different. Authority. Calm, focus, almost as if they are observing, not just representing. And that detail stays with you. Because when you stand in front of one, it doesn't feel like a statue. It feels like a presence. And then the theories begin. Some suggest these are portraits of Olmec rulers, that each head represents a leader, carved to preserve their image. That would explain the individuality. But it doesn't fully explain the scale, because creating something this large requires intention, not just to represent, but to emphasize, to amplify, which means these figures were important. Extremely important. Others suggest something different, that these were not just portraits, but symbols, representations of power, authority, identity, placed in specific locations to mark territory or influence. And then there are more unconventional ideas, that the features themselves suggest something unusual, that they don't match typical representations from the region, that they appear different. This idea is debated, often dismissed, but it exists, because the faces don't feel stylized. They feel observed, and that creates a different kind of question. Not just who they represent, but how accurately they were captured, and from what reference. Of course, there is a grounded explanation for everything, that this is simply the result of a highly skilled ancient civilization, that the Olmec had the ability, the organization, and the knowledge to create and transport these structures, and most evidence supports that. But even then, there are details that remain, because creating one is impressive, creating many, transporting them, positioning them, maintaining their individuality. That's something else. That's a system. And systems don't happen without structure, without knowledge, without purpose. And maybe that purpose was understood at the time. Clear, defined. But now, it's gone. What remains are the faces, silent, unmoving, and still watching. Because long after the people who carved them disappeared, the heads remain. Unchanged, unexplained, placed in the landscape as if they were meant to stay. Not just as monuments, but as something else, something that continues to exist even after its meaning is lost. And maybe that's what makes them different. Because they don't just represent the past, they hold it in stone, in silence, and in a form that still feels strangely alive. The underground city. In central Turkey, beneath what looks like an ordinary town, there is an entrance that doesn't seem important. A small opening. Easy to miss, easy to ignore. But it leads somewhere. Not into a room, not into a cave, but into a city. Carved directly into the earth. This is Derinkuyu. At first it feels narrow. Low ceilings, tight corridors, rough stone walls, but then it continues, and continues, and continues, descending deeper, level after level, until you realize something. This isn't a tunnel system. It's structured, planned, organized. Entire sections branch out from central passages, rooms connected to other rooms, spaces with purpose, storage areas, living quarters, ventilation shafts, even places for animals. All of it underground, and not just shallow. Derinkuyu goes down more than 60 meters, deep enough to disappear completely from the surface, deep enough to remain hidden, and that raises the first real question. Why build a city underground? The common answer is protection. In this region, invasions were frequent, conflicts were constant. Moving below the surface offered safety. Hidden entrances, narrow passages, defensive advantages. And that explanation works until you look closer, because this isn't temporary shelter. It's permanent, designed for long-term use. Thousands of people could live here for extended periods, which means this wasn't built in response to a single threat. It was built with expectation, as if whoever created it knew they would need it. And not just once, again and again. That level of planning changes things. Because carving into soft volcanic rock is possible, but carving an entire city, that's something else. Rooms large enough to gather, passages wide enough to move through, systems that connect everything, ventilation shafts reaching all the way to the surface, allowing air to circulate even at the deepest levels. That requires design, not just digging, understanding. Because without proper airflow, none of this would work. And yet it does, even now. Some of the shafts still function, air still moves, which means whoever built this understood how to sustain life underground. And that's not simple knowledge, that's engineering. Then there's the water. Because air is one thing, but water is another. Some wells extend down through the city, connecting to underground water sources, independent of the surface. which means even if the entrances were blocked, the people inside could survive for long periods, completely isolated. And that suggests something important. This wasn't just about hiding. It was about staying. And then there are the doors, not ordinary doors. Massive stone discs, round, heavy, placed within the tunnels. They could be rolled into position, sealing entire sections of the city from the inside, not the outside, which means they weren't meant to keep people in. They were meant to keep something out. And that detail changes the feeling of the entire place, because now it's not just a shelter, it's a defensive system, layered, controlled, designed to isolate, to protect. But from what? The official explanation returns to invasion. That these doors were used to block access during attacks. That enemies unfamiliar with the layout would be unable to navigate the tunnels. And again, that makes sense. But then there's the scale, because Derinkuyu is not alone. There are other underground cities in the region, connected through tunnels, extending for kilometers, which means this wasn't a single project. It was part of something larger, a network. And networks don't exist without coordination, without shared purpose, which suggests that whatever this was built for, it wasn't isolated, it was expected, repeated. And then there's the timeline, because parts of Derinkuyu are believed to be ancient, very ancient, expanded over time, modified, used by different civilizations. But the original construction is less clear. Some attribute it to the Phrygians, others to later groups, but no one can say exactly when it began, or why it reached this scale. Because digging a few tunnels is understandable, building a city underground, that requires something more. Intent. And then there's the experience, because standing at the entrance is one thing. Going inside is something else. The deeper you go, the quieter it becomes. Sound changes. The air feels different. The walls close in. And the surface disappears completely. No light, no reference, just space carved into darkness. And the realization that this was once filled with people. Living, cooking, sleeping. Entire lives happening beneath the ground. Hidden. And that raises one final question. What kind of world exists above when living below? It becomes necessary. Of course, there is always the grounded explanation. That this was built for safety. That history was unstable, dangerous, and people adapted. And maybe that's all it is. But even then, the scale remains. The depth remains. The intention remains, because this wasn't built quickly. It wasn't built casually. It was built to last. And it did. Long after the reasons for its construction faded, long after the people who built it disappeared, the city remains, silent, hidden, waiting beneath the surface. And maybe that's the most important part, because some structures aren't meant to be seen. They're meant to be there, in case they are needed again. The temple's older than pyramids. On a small island in the Mediterranean, there are structures that existed long before most of what we call ancient history even began. They stand quietly on the island of Gozo, part of modern-day Malta. Low stone walls, curved shapes, weathered surfaces. At first, they don't look like much. Not towering, not dramatic. But they are old, extremely old. Older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge. Built around 3600 BCE. And that alone changes how you look at them. Because structures this early should be simple, temporary. But these are not. They are massive. Constructed from limestone blocks weighing several tons. Placed, arranged, aligned, with intention. This is Gantija, and the name itself carries meaning. It comes from the Maltese word for giant, because when people first saw these stones, there was only one explanation that made sense. Giants built them, not because of myth, but because of scale, because moving stones like this shouldn't be easy, and yet they were moved. positioned into curved walls forming enclosed spaces, chambers, connected through narrow passages, arranged in a pattern that doesn't feel random, but designed. The layout is distinctive. A central corridor leading into rounded chambers, almost like a series of connected rooms. Not defensive, not residential. Something else. Because there are no signs of daily life, no evidence of cooking, no signs of long-term habitation. Instead, there are altars, stone platforms, areas that suggest gathering, ritual, which leads to the first conclusion. These were temples, places of ceremony, built for purposes beyond survival. And that raises the first real question. How? Because the people who built Gantija lived in a time before metal tools. No iron, no steel, only stone tools. And yet, they shaped limestone blocks weighing several tons, transported them, and placed them with precision. The common explanation is simple. Time and effort. Logs used to roll stones. Ropes, levers, slow movement across short distances. And again, it's possible. But there are details that complicate that idea. Because the stones are not just stacked, they are arranged, curved deliberately, forming structures that feel planned from the beginning, not adjusted over time, which suggests design, understanding of space, and then there's the orientation. Some parts of the temple align with the sun. Light enters at specific angles during certain times of the year, illuminating interior spaces. That's not accidental. That requires observation, tracking movement, planning construction around it. And that's something we usually associate with later civilizations. But here, it exists much earlier. And then there's something else. The scale. Because building one structure like this is impressive. Building multiple, even more so. The Gantija complex includes more than one temple, each with similar features, which means this wasn't a single effort. It was a system, a tradition, repeated. And that leads to a deeper question. What kind of society builds something like this? Because this isn't survival architecture. This is symbolic, which means time, labor, and resources were directed toward something beyond basic need. Ritual, belief, meaning. And that implies organization, coordination, shared understanding, which suggests that even at this early stage, human societies were more complex than we often assume. But even with all of that, there are still details that remain unclear. Because while we know how these structures might have been built, we don't fully know why. What exactly took place inside these chambers? What rituals were performed? What did these spaces represent to the people who built them? There are theories, fertility rituals, connections to the earth, ceremonies tied to cycles of nature, but no written records remain. No direct explanation. Only the structures. And then there's the construction itself. Some stones are enormous, larger than what seems practical for the time. Which brings back the same question. Not just how, but why build at this scale? Because scale is a choice. And here, that choice was made repeatedly, as if size mattered, as if the presence of the structure itself was part of its meaning. And then there's the feeling of the place, because standing inside these chambers is different. The walls curve around you. The space feels enclosed, but not confined. Sound changes. The outside world fades, and the structure begins to feel separate, like it was designed to create a specific experience, not just a physical space, but something else. And that idea appears again in other ancient sites. Spaces built not just for use, but for effect, for atmosphere, for something we don't fully describe anymore. And maybe that's the key. Because while we can measure the stones, analyze the layout, study the alignment, we can't fully recover the intention. That part is gone. What remains is the result. Stone walls, standing, thousands of years later, still holding their shape, still marking a place that once mattered, and still raising the same question. How did something this complex exist so early? Because the timeline suggests simplicity, but the evidence suggests something else, something more advanced. Not in technology, but in understanding. And maybe that's the part we overlook, because progress isn't always linear, and knowledge doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it appears early and then disappears, leaving behind structures like this. Quiet, ancient, and still standing. Long before they should have existed, the cliff houses built into the mountain. Along the canyon walls of what is now Colorado, there are structures that don't sit on the land. They are part of it, carved into the cliffs, tucked beneath overhanging rock, hidden in shadows that shift with the sun. From a distance, they almost disappear. Stone against stone. Walls blending into the mountain itself. But as you get closer, the details begin to separate. Rectangular openings, stacked rooms, paths and ladders connecting different levels, an entire settlement. Built into the cliff face, this is Mesa Verde. And the first thing that stands out isn't the construction, it's the location. Because these structures are not easy to reach. They are positioned high above the canyon floor, accessible only by narrow paths, steep climbs, routes that require careful movement. Which raises the first question. Why build here? The immediate answer is protection. From above, the overhanging rock shields the structures from rain and weather. From below, the height makes access difficult. It's a natural defense, but that's only part of it. Because this isn't just one structure, there are many. Entire communities built along different sections of the canyon. Hundreds of rooms. Grouped together, organized. Which means this wasn't temporary shelter, this was home. And building a home here changes the question. Because now it's not just about safety, it's about choice. The people who built these cliff dwellings, known as the ancestral Puebloans, lived in this region for centuries. Before moving into the cliffs, they built on the mesa tops. Open land, easier access, more space. And then something changed. They moved down into the rock. Not gradually, but deliberately. Which suggests a reason, a strong one. Some researchers believe it was environmental, changes in climate, drought, a need to adapt. The cliffs offered shade, temperature, stability, protection from the elements. And that makes sense, but it doesn't explain everything. Because building here is not simple. Materials had to be carried. Stone, water, food, all moved up and down steep terrain. Every day. That's not efficient. Unless the location provides something more valuable. And then there's the design. The rooms are not random. They are structured. Walls built from shaped stone. Mortar holding them together. Openings aligned. Spaces connected. Some rooms are circular, kivas. Ceremonial spaces built partially underground, which suggests something beyond daily living. Ritual, community, meaning. And that detail shifts the perspective again, because now this isn't just a settlement, it's a system, a place where life and ceremony exist together. And then there's the scale. Cliff Palace, the largest of these sites, contains over 150 rooms, multiple levels, organized into clusters, connected by ladders and pathways. That requires planning, not just building. Understanding how people move, how they live, how they interact. And then there's the question of time. Because these structures were not built all at once, they developed, expanded, over generations. Which means the knowledge of how to build here was passed down, refined, repeated. And that suggests stability, continuity, a society that understood its environment, and adapted to it. But then something happens. Around the late 1200s, the site is abandoned. Not gradually, but completely. The people leave. The structures remain. No clear evidence of destruction. No signs of sudden collapse. Just absence. Which creates another question. Why leave a place like this? Theories exist. Drought, resource depletion, conflict, social change, all possible, but none fully explain the scale of the abandonment, because this wasn't a small settlement. This was a functioning community, built over time, sustained, and then left behind. And that leaves something unresolved, because the structures are still there. Walls intact, rooms defined, spaces preserved, as if the people could return at any time, but they didn't. And that creates a different kind of mystery. Not about how it was built, but why it was left, because building into a cliff like this is not temporary. It's a commitment, a decision to stay. And leaving it means something changed, something significant. And whatever that was, it isn't fully recorded. What remains is the architecture, the placement, the choice, and the silence. Because standing there now, looking at those structures built into the rock, it doesn't feel like ruins. It feels paused, like something interrupted, and never resumed. And maybe that's the most unusual part. Because the cliff still holds the structures still hold their shape, and the space still feels like it was meant to be lived in, but no one is there, and hasn't been for centuries. The ancient pyramid beneath lava. On the southern edge of modern Mexico City, there is a structure that doesn't immediately look like a pyramid. No sharp angles, no towering peak. Instead, it spreads outward, low, circular, layered. At first, it feels incomplete, almost buried. And in a way, it is. This is Cuicuilco, one of the oldest known pyramid structures in the Americas. But what makes it different isn't just its shape, it's what surrounds it. Because this entire site is covered in hardened lava. Black, dense, uneven, stretching across the landscape like a frozen wave. And that changes everything. Because this pyramid wasn't built on the lava. The lava came later. At some point in the past, a volcanic eruption from a nearby source, known today as Zittel, sent molten rock across the region, slow, relentless, covering everything in its path. Settlements, fields, structures, including this. And that means something important. This pyramid existed before the eruption, before the destruction, before the land changed completely, which places its construction far earlier than many other known structures in the region, around 700 BCE, possibly even earlier. And that alone raises questions. Because at that time, large-scale pyramid construction in Mesoamerica was still developing. And yet, here, there is a fully formed structure, deliberate, planned, with a design that doesn't follow the later patterns seen in more famous sites. Because this pyramid is not square, it is circular, built in layers that rise gradually toward the center, wide at the base, narrowing as it moves upward, almost like a stepped platform, but shaped differently. And that difference matters. Because most pyramids are designed for elevation, to rise high, to dominate the landscape. This one doesn't. It spreads, which suggests a different purpose. Not just visibility, but space, gathering, movement. And then there's the placement, because Cuicuilco wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger settlement, a functioning community, with structures, pathways, and organization, which means this pyramid wasn't just built. It was used, integrated into daily life, and that suggests meaning, ceremony, ritual, something that required presence, repeatedly. But then everything stops, because the eruption changes the landscape completely. Lava covers the region, forces the population to leave, destroys the surrounding environment, and freezes the site in time, preserved beneath a layer of hardened rock. And that preservation is unusual, because destruction usually removes evidence. But here, it protects it. seals it, leaving parts of the structure intact, hidden, until it is rediscovered, and when it is, it doesn't fit easily into the timeline. Because its design is different, its age is early, and its location suggests it was once part of something larger that no longer exists. Which raises another question. What else was lost? Because the lava didn't just cover one structure, it covered an entire region, which means there may have been more. More buildings, more systems, more evidence of a society we only partially understand. And most of it is still buried beneath layers of volcanic rock, which means the full picture isn't visible, only fragments. And then there's the construction itself, because building with stone is one thing, building a structure that lasts through volcanic activity is another. The pyramid didn't collapse, it remained, partially covered, but structurally intact, which suggests durability, stability, design that could withstand pressure, and that's not accidental. Even if the builders didn't anticipate the eruption, the structure they created was strong enough to endure it. And that says something about how it was built, carefully, deliberately, with understanding of material. And then there's the question of why it was circular, because that choice is unusual. Most later pyramids follow angular designs, sharp edges, defined corners. This one doesn't. It flows, continuous, which could suggest something symbolic. Cycles, movement, time. Ideas that appear in many early cultures, but without written records. The exact meaning remains uncertain. What remains is the structure, partially hidden, partially revealed, caught between what it was and what it became. Because Quiquilco is not just a pyramid, it's a moment, preserved, a point in time where a society built something and then disappeared from that place, not gradually, but suddenly, and left behind only what the lava allowed to survive. And maybe that's the most important detail. Because unlike ruins that fade over time, this one was sealed, protected by destruction, which means what we see today is only what was exposed, and what remains beneath is still unknown, and will likely remain that way, because uncovering it would require removing the very layer that preserved it, which means the full story may never be revealed, only suggested, through fragments, through structure, through something that existed long before it was buried, and still exists now, because it was the mysterious stone grid. On a remote plateau in the Golan Heights, there's a structure that doesn't rise into the sky. It spreads across the ground. From above, it looks like a pattern, circles, multiple rings of stone, layered, connected. And at the center, something else, a mound. This is known as Rujum el Hiri, sometimes called Gilgal Rephaim. And at first, it doesn't feel like a building. There are no walls in the usual sense, no clear entrance, no obvious purpose, just stone, thousands of them, arranged deliberately. The outer ring measures over 150 meters in diameter, massive, built from basalt stones scattered across the landscape, stacked into low walls, forming concentric circles that tighten toward the center. And that's where the first question appears. Why build this? Because this isn't defensive. It doesn't protect anything. It doesn't enclose space in a way that suggests living. And it doesn't resemble typical ceremonial structures either. At least, not at first. The stones are rough, unshaped, placed rather than carved, which suggests something different. The meaning isn't in the individual pieces, it's in the arrangement, in the pattern, and patterns like this are rarely accidental. They are designed, which means whoever built this was working with intention. But intention toward what? One theory suggests astronomy, that the structure was aligned with the movement of the sun. Certain points within the circles correspond to the sunrise during the summer solstice. Light passing through specific openings, touching specific stones, at specific times. That's not random, that's observation. But there's a problem. The alignments are not perfect, close, but not exact, which means if this was an observatory, it wasn't precise, or precision wasn't the goal, and that changes the interpretation, because now it's not just about measuring, it's about marking, about recognizing cycles, not calculating them. And that leads to another idea: ritual, a place where movement mattered, not just of the sun, but of people, because the structure isn't just a circle, it's a path, moving inward through layers, toward the center, which suggests experience, a progression from outside to inside, from open to enclosed. And that kind of design appears in other ancient sites. Spaces built not just to exist, but to be moved through, to be experienced step by step. And then there's the center, the mound, raised, different from the surrounding rings, which suggests importance. But here's the detail that complicates everything. The central mound was built later, not at the same time as the circles, which means the original structure identity was just the rings. No center, no focal point, just the pattern. And that changes everything, because now the question isn't just what it is, but what it was first and why it changed. The site is estimated to be over 5,000 years old, possibly dating back to the early Bronze Age, which places it among some of the oldest large-scale stone structures in the region. And yet, it doesn't resemble anything else nearby. No clear parallels, no direct comparisons, which makes it difficult to classify. And structures that don't fit often remain unexplained. Then there's something else. From ground level, the pattern isn't obvious. You can walk through it without realizing what you're inside. The circles don't reveal themselves easily. They only make sense from above. And that raises a different kind of question. Why build something that can't be fully seen? Because the people who built it didn't have aerial views, no way to observe the full design at once. And yet, they created it, which means they understood the pattern without needing to see it. They worked from knowledge, from plan, from something internal. And that's not simple, because maintaining accuracy across that scale, without visual reference, requires coordination, measurement, system. And then there's the name, Gilgal Rephaim, often translated as Wheel of Giants, a name given later. But it reflects something. Because when people encounter structures like this, they search for explanations. And when none are clear, they turn to scale, to size, to the idea that something larger than human effort must have been involved. Not because of myth, but because of difficulty. Because building something like this is not easy, even if the materials are simple. And then there's the silence of the site. No inscriptions, no carvings, no direct clues left behind, just stone and pattern and placement, which means everything we understand about it is interpretation, based on structure, alignment, possibility, but not certainty. And that leaves something open, because when a structure has no clear explanation, it doesn't just become mysterious, it becomes flexible, capable of holding multiple meanings, astronomical, ritual, symbolic, or something else entirely. And maybe that's why it remains, because it doesn't resolve. It doesn't settle into a single explanation. It stays unclear. And that uncertainty becomes part of it. Because standing within those circles, walking through those layers, you don't just observe the structure, you experience it without fully understanding it. And that may be the closest we can get, because some structures are not meant to be explained easily. They are meant to be encountered and left as they are. The hidden fortress on a hill. On a quiet stretch of land in southern England, the ground begins to rise almost gently, forming a wide hill that doesn't seem unusual at first. It blends into the landscape so naturally that, unless you know what you're looking for, you might walk past it without realizing what it is. But this hill is not natural. It is shaped, carefully, over time. This is Maiden Castle, one of the largest prehistoric hill forts in Europe. and from above its true form begins to reveal itself. Not a single wall, but layers. Rings of earth and ditches wrapping around the hill in curved lines, enclosing a space that feels far larger than expected. The shape isn't perfectly symmetrical, but it is deliberate, expanding across the hilltop in a way that suggests planning rather than chance. At ground level, the scale is harder to understand. The walls feel like slopes, the ditches like natural dips in the land. But when you follow them, walking along the edges, you begin to notice the pattern repeating again and again. Barrier, gap, barrier. It wasn't built quickly. The earliest activity on this hill dates back thousands of years, long before the final structure took shape. Over time, the fort expanded, growing larger and more complex as if each generation added something new rather than starting over. And that matters, because it means this wasn't just a construction. It was a place that stayed important. At its peak, Maiden Castle enclosed a vast area, large enough to hold not just structures, but an entire community. Evidence suggests houses once stood within the walls, along with storage areas and spaces for daily life. This wasn't a temporary refuge. People lived here. But the design still raises questions, because the defenses are unusually complex. Multiple ramparts, deep ditches, entrances that don't lead straight inside but curve and narrow, forcing movement to slow. Anyone approaching would not walk, not directly in. They would be guided, turned, exposed from different angles. It's controlled, carefully controlled, and yet, despite all of that, there's something about the structure that doesn't feel purely defensive, because building on a hill like this already provides advantage. Height offers visibility, it creates distance, it makes approach difficult. But here, the defenses go further than necessary, layer after layer, expansion after expansion, which suggests something else. Not just protection, but importance. Because places that matter tend to grow. They attract people. They evolve. And sometimes their structure becomes as much about identity as it is about function. Excavations at Maiden Castle revealed signs of conflict, human remains, evidence of injury, moments where the site was not peaceful, which supports the idea that it was used defensively. But that's only part of the story, because long before those moments, the hill was already occupied, already shaped, already significant, and then something changes. Around the time of the Roman arrival in Britain, the site begins to lose its importance. Activity decreases. Structures are no longer maintained in the same way. Eventually, the hill fort is abandoned. Not destroyed. Not erased. Just left behind, which is a pattern that appears again and again in ancient sites. Places that were once central, gradually becoming silent. And what remains is the shape. The earth still holds the lines. The ramparts still rise. The ditches still cut through the hill. Even after centuries of wind and weather, the structure hasn't disappeared. It has softened, but it hasn't gone. From above, it still looks deliberate, still recognizable, still present. And that creates a different kind of experience. Because walking through Maiden Castle today doesn't feel like entering ruins. It feels like moving through something that has been paused. There are no walls. Standing. No roofs. No clear markers of where life once happened. But the space remains. And the design still guides movement. You follow the same paths. Enter through the same controlled openings. Move along the same rising ground. Without needing to be told. And maybe that's the most interesting part. Because even without the structures, the intention is still there. The hill was shaped for a reason, expanded for a reason, defended for a reason, and then left. Not because it failed, but because something changed. And whatever that was, is no longer visible. What remains is the form, the outline of a place that once held people, movement, purpose. Now quiet, now still, but not gone. Because some structures don't disappear. They settle into the landscape, become part of it. And over time, they stop looking like something built and start looking like something that was always there, until you notice the pattern. And once you do, you realize it was never just a hill, the crystal lens that shouldn't exist. In the ruins of an ancient Assyrian city, among fragments of stone, broken walls, and objects long buried beneath the earth, a small piece of crystal was found. It didn't look important. Not at first. Roughly oval in shape, slightly cloudy, with an uneven surface that seemed almost accidental, as if it had simply been shaped by time rather than intention. Compared to the monumental architecture surrounding it, it was easy to overlook. But then it was examined more closely, because this wasn't just a piece of stone, it was worked, deliberately shaped from rock crystal, a material that, while naturally occurring, is not easy to carve with precision. And yet, the surface showed signs of polishing. Not perfect, not modern, but controlled enough to suggest purpose. This object is now known as the Nimrud lens, and the moment you understand what it might be, the questions begin. Because when light passes through it, something changes. It bends. Not dramatically, not like modern glass lenses, but enough to create a magnifying effect. Objects seen through it appear slightly enlarged, slightly clearer, subtle, but undeniable. And that detail is difficult to ignore, because magnification implies understanding, not just of material, but of light itself. The lens is believed to date back to around the 8th century BCE, during the height of the Assyrian Empire, a time known for monumental construction, complex administration, and detailed craftsmanship, but not, according to conventional understanding, for optical instruments. And that's where the contradiction begins, because lenses are not simple objects. To create one intentionally, even at a basic level, requires recognition that shaping a transparent material in a certain way can alter how light passes through it. It requires experimentation, observation, repetition, and most importantly, awareness of the effects. So the question becomes, unavoidable. Was this intentional? Some researchers believe it was. That the Nimrud lens may have been used as a simple magnifying tool, possibly for detailed work such as engraving or craftsmanship. Assyrian artisans were known for intricate carvings, fine details that would benefit from enhanced vision. In that context, the lens makes sense. But there are problems with that explanation, because the magnification is limited, not strong, not consistent across the entire surface, which makes it useful, but not precise. And then there's another idea, that it may have been used to focus sunlight. Under the right conditions, a curved crystal can concentrate light into a single point, producing heat. Enough, potentially, to start a small fire. This has been suggested as a practical use. Again, possible, but not confirmed. And then there's a third possibility, one that moves away from utility. That the object was not primarily functional, but observational. That it may have been used to look at the sky. Stars, planets. Because even a simple lens can slightly enhance brightness, making faint objects more visible. It wouldn't be a telescope, but it would be a step, a small shift in perception. And that idea leads somewhere else, because ancient civilizations were already observing the sky with attention, tracking movement, recording patterns, aligning structures with celestial events, which means the concept of observation was already there. The question is whether it extended further. Into tools. Into objects like this. And then there's another detail. The lens is not perfectly shaped. It contains imperfections, small distortions, which means if it was used, it would not produce a clear, uniform image. But that doesn't mean it wasn't useful. Early tools are rarely perfect. They are functional, experimental, steps towards something else. And that possibility changes the way the object is seen, because instead of being an anomaly, it becomes part of a process, an early attempt. But then there's a different perspective. Some researchers argue that the lens was not meant to be a lens at all, that its shape is incidental, that the magnification is accidental, that it may have been decorative, or part of a larger object now lost, and that explanation removes the mystery. It places the object back into a known category, but it doesn't fully resolve the question, because the shaping is still there, the polishing, the curvature, even if imperfect. And then there's the context, because this object was found in a place of significance, within a major Assyrian site, among artifacts that were not random, which suggests it had value, that it was kept, not discarded. And that implies recognition, that whoever possessed it understood it was something, even if we don't fully understand what. And then there's the broader pattern, because this is not the only ancient object that raises questions about early optics. Other artifacts in different parts of the world have been suggested to function as lenses. Some clearer, some more debated. But together they point to a possibility, that the understanding of light may have begun earlier than we assume. Not fully developed, but present. In small forms. In objects like this. And maybe that's the key, because progress doesn't always appear suddenly. It builds slowly, through small discoveries, small observations, moments where something behaves differently, and someone notices, and decides to shape it, to test it, to keep it. And that's what this could represent. Not advanced technology, but awareness. The recognition that something invisible, light, can be influenced, altered, controlled, even slightly. And that realization alone is significant, because it changes how the world is seen. And maybe that's why the object remains. Small, simple, but still raising the same question. Not just what it is, but what it means. Because sometimes the most important discoveries are not the largest ones. They are the ones that seem small at first, until you understand what they imply. And this may be one of them, the Trilobite fossil and the shoe print. In the deserts of Utah, where layers of ancient rock are exposed to the surface, fossils are not unusual. They appear embedded in stone, preserved from a time when the landscape was completely different. A time when oceans covered this region, long before deserts formed, long before humans existed. Among these fossils, one discovery stands out. Not because of what it is, but because of what it appears to show. A trilobite, an ancient marine creature that lived over 500 million years ago, now extinct, common in fossil records, well understood. But this particular fossil is different, because it appears to be crushed, not by natural pressure, not by shifting sediment, but by something shaped like a human shoe. The impression is clear enough to raise questions. A defined outline, a curved edge, a flattened section where the trilobite sits beneath it, as if something stepped on it. And that's where the problem begins, because trilobites existed hundreds of millions of years before humans, before mammals, before anything resembling modern life. So the two should never appear together. And yet, in this case, they seem to. The fossil was reportedly discovered in the mid-20th century, embedded within a slab of rock. The shape above it resembled the outline of a shoe sole, pressing into the surface with enough force to leave a visible mark. At first, it was treated as a curiosity. Then, as the image spread, it became something else, a contradiction. Because if the impression is genuine, it suggests something impossible, that something with a shoe-like structure existed at the same time as trilobites, which doesn't align with any accepted timeline, and that's why the claim became controversial. Some saw it as evidence of something unknown. Others saw it as a misunderstanding, and the difference between those two interpretations is important because fossils can be deceptive. Rock fractures, pressure patterns, natural formations. Under certain conditions, they can create shapes that resemble familiar objects. The human brain is especially sensitive to this. It looks for patterns, recognizes outlines, fills in gaps, which means not everything that looks intentional actually is. Many geologists argue that this is the case here, that the shoe print is not a print at all, but a natural fracture in the rock, a break that occurred over time, creating an outline that happens to resemble something familiar. The trilobite beneath it may have been compressed during fossilization, giving the appearance of being stepped on. Individually, these details can be explained. Together, they create something that looks unusual. And that's where interpretation takes over. Because once the idea of a shoe print is introduced, it becomes difficult not to see it. The shape reinforces itself, and the story builds around it. But then there are those who question the explanation, because the outline appears consistent. The pressure seems directional, and the positioning of the trilobite within the impression feels specific, as if it was affected by something above it, not just surrounding pressure. And that's where the uncertainty remains, because without the original context, without precise documentation of where and how it was found, the interpretation becomes less stable, which is often the case with discoveries like this. They exist in fragments, a single object, a single image, separated from the full environment that could explain it. And once that context is missing, multiple explanations become possible. Some grounded, some more speculative. There are those who connect this to broader ideas, that the timeline of life on Earth may not be as straightforward as we believe, that there could have been events, cycles, or unknown factors that left traces we don't fully understand. But these ideas remain outside accepted science, because they require more than a single example. They require consistent evidence, repeatable findings, and so far, that hasn't been established, which brings the focus back to the object itself. A fossil, a shape, an impression that appears to show something that shouldn't be there, and that's where it stays. Not confirmed, not fully explained. Existing somewhere between interpretation and evidence. And maybe that's what makes it persist, because it doesn't resolve. It doesn't settle into a single answer. It remains open, and in that space, it continues to raise questions, not just about the object itself, but about how we interpret what we see, because sometimes the mystery isn't in the stone. It's in the way we look at it, what we recognize, what we assume, and what we're willing to question. And this is one of those cases where the line between explanation and uncertainty is still not completely clear. The ancient battery. In the region of ancient Mesopotamia, near modern-day Baghdad, a small object was discovered that didn't immediately stand out. It wasn't large, it wasn't decorative, and compared to the monumental ruins of the surrounding civilizations, it seemed almost insignificant. A simple clay jar, about the size of a hand. At first glance, it looked like many other containers found in archaeological sites. Something used to store materials, liquids, or small objects. Functional, ordinary, and easy to categorize. But when it was examined more closely, something unusual appeared. Inside the jar, there was a copper cylinder, and through the center of that cylinder, an iron rod, separated, not touching, and sealed at the top with a bitumen-like material, as if the components were meant to remain fixed in place. That combination changes how the object is understood, because when you look at it through a modern lens, it resembles something familiar. A basic electrochemical cell. A battery. And that's where the questions begin. The object is believed to date back to around the Parthian period, possibly between 250 BCE and 250 CE, a time known for trade, craftsmanship, and interaction between cultures, but not, according to conventional history, for the use of electricity. And yet, when similar configurations are recreated today using a mild acidic liquid inside the jar, they can produce a small electrical current. Not strong, not enough to power anything complex, but measurable. And that detail is difficult to ignore, because it suggests that the design, whether intentional or not, has the capacity to generate electricity. Which leads to the central question. Was that the purpose? Some researchers believe it was. That these jars may have been used for electroplating, a process where a thin layer of metal is deposited onto another surface using electric current. This could explain certain ancient objects that appear to have fine metallic coatings. In that interpretation, the battery becomes a tool. Simple, but functional. However, there are challenges with that idea, because there is limited direct evidence linking these jars to electroplating. No wires, no clear system connecting multiple units, and the current produced would be minimal, which makes large-scale application difficult. And then there's another explanation, that the object was not a battery at all, but a storage vessel, possibly for scrolls or sacred materials, the copper cylinder protecting what was placed inside, the iron rod serving a structural or symbolic purpose. In that context, the electrical effect becomes incidental, a coincidence created by the combination of materials. And that explanation is supported by the fact that similar jars have been found without clear signs of electrical use. But even then, the structure remains unusual, because the components are arranged in a way that feels deliberate. Copper, iron, separation. That combination is not random. And even if the original builders did not understand electricity in modern terms, they may have observed effects, reactions, changes that occurred when materials interacted. And that brings the focus to something important. Because knowledge doesn't always begin as theory. It often begins as observation. A reaction noticed. A pattern repeated. Without fully understanding why it works, only that it does. And if something like this produced even a small sensation, a mild shock, a visible reaction in a liquid, that would be enough to notice, enough to experiment, enough to remember. And then there's another possibility, that the object had a symbolic purpose, that the arrangement of materials carried meaning beyond function. Metal inside clay, sealed, contained, representing something we no longer fully understand. Because in ancient cultures, objects were often both practical and symbolic at the same time, and separating those two aspects isn't always easy. Then there's the broader question. Because if this object was capable of producing electricity, even at a small scale, what does that imply? Not that ancient civilizations had modern technology, but that they may have encountered effects we associate with later discoveries, and responded to them in their own way, without formal theory, without documentation that survives today, only through objects. And this could be one of them. Or it could be something else entirely. A container, a tool, a coincidence. And that uncertainty is what keeps the discussion open, because the object doesn't fully confirm one explanation, but it doesn't completely dismiss the others either. It exists somewhere in between. And in that space, it continues to raise questions. Not just about what it is, but about how much we assume we know. Because history is often built from patterns, from repeated evidence, but sometimes there are pieces that don't fit perfectly. Small objects, simple forms, that suggests something slightly different. And this is one of them. A clay jar, with metal inside. Quiet, unremarkable at first glance, but when examined more closely, capable of changing how we think about the past, even if only slightly, and sometimes that's enough. The map that shows Antarctica without ice. In 1929, inside a museum in Istanbul, an old map was rediscovered. It wasn't complete. Only a fragment had survived. Drawn on parchment, detailed, carefully labeled. At first it didn't seem unusual, just another early world map, created during a time when much of the planet was still being explored and documented in pieces. But then, it was studied more closely, because this map showed something unexpected. It was created by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis in the early 16th century, around 1513. He compiled it using earlier source maps, some of which he claimed were already ancient at the time. And that detail matters, because the map doesn't just show known regions, it shows coastlines, with surprising accuracy. Parts of South America appear in recognizable form. The western coast of Africa aligns closely with modern geography. Even the relative positioning of certain landmasses seems more precise than expected for that period. And then there's the southern section, a landmass drawn along the bottom edge of the map. At first, it was assumed to be a distorted extension of South America, but over time, some researchers suggested something different, that this section might represent Antarctica. And not just Antarctica as we know it today, but Antarctica, without ice. That idea is where the mystery begins, because Antarctica as a continent was not officially discovered until the early 19th century. And even after its discovery, its full coastline remained hidden beneath thick ice sheets. So if this map does show Antarctica, the question becomes unavoidable. How? Some interpretations suggest that the coastline depicted on the map resembles the land beneath the ice, particularly in areas like Queen Maud Land, which would imply something extraordinary, that whoever created the original source maps had access to knowledge of the continent before it was covered in ice, or before it was forgotten. And that's where the idea becomes difficult to accept, because according to current understanding, Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years, long before human civilization, which means no known society should have been able to map it in that state. And yet the suggestion remains. But there are other explanations. Many cartographers argue that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is not Antarctica at all, but a misrepresentation, an extension of South America drawn inaccurately due to limited information. Early maps often contained distortions, coastlines stretched, land masses merged, unknown regions filled in with assumption rather than observation. And in that context, the map fits. It becomes a product of its time, imperfect, interpreted, but not impossible, and that explanation is widely accepted. But even then, there are details that keep the discussion open, because Piri Reis himself noted that he used multiple sources, maps from different origins, some ancient, some possibly dating back much further than his own time. And that raises another question. What were those sources? Because if earlier maps existed, where did they come from? And how accurate were they? History often preserves fragments, copies of copies. Information passed down, altered, and reinterpreted over time. Which means even if the Piri Reis map contains inaccuracies, it may also contain traces of older knowledge. Not complete, but present. And that's where the uncertainty remains, because the map is not perfectly accurate, but it's not entirely random either. It sits somewhere in between, detailed in some areas, unclear in others, which makes it difficult to classify. And then there's the broader context, because this is not the only historical map that raises questions about early geographic knowledge. Other maps from different periods show similar patterns. Unexpected accuracy in some regions, unexpected distortions in others, suggesting that knowledge was not uniform, it was partial, uneven, built from different sources with varying levels of reliability. And that may be what we're seeing here. Not a single accurate depiction, but a combination. Pieces of real observation, combined with assumption, combined with interpretation, and over the sphere that moved on its own. In 1974, on a quiet piece of land in Florida, a family discovered something unusual. Not buried deep underground, not hidden inside ruins, just sitting there. A metal sphere, smooth, polished, almost perfectly round. At first, it didn't seem important, just an object. Out of place, maybe, but not immediately strange. It was about the size of a bowling ball, heavy for its size, made of metal that didn't show obvious seams or joints. No markings, no labels, nothing to suggest where it came from. The family brought it home, and for a while, nothing happened. It sat there, silent, still, until it didn't. According to the reports, the sphere began to behave in ways that were difficult to explain. It would roll on its own, not randomly, but in response to movement. If someone pushed it, it didn't just roll away. It would change direction, sometimes returning, as if correcting its path. That alone would be unusual. But then there were other details. When placed on the floor, the sphere would sometimes move without being touched. Slowly, adjusting its position. Not continuously, but enough to be noticed. And then there was the sound. When struck lightly, the sphere didn't produce a dull metallic tone. It rang. A clear, sustained vibration, almost like something hollow, or tuned. And that added another layer to the mystery, because now it wasn't just movement. It was response. The family began experimenting, rolling it across surfaces, observing how it behaved. They noticed that it didn't follow simple paths. It curved, adjusted, and in some cases, returned. That detail changed how it was perceived, because objects don't usually do that. Once pushed, they follow momentum. They don't correct themselves unless something else is involved, and that's where the questions began. Some suggested that the sphere contained a mechanism, something on inside, shifting weight, altering balance, creating movement. But there were no visible openings, no seams, no indication that it could be opened or adjusted, which made that explanation difficult to confirm. Others proposed something simpler, that the surface it was placed on was uneven, that slight slopes caused the movement, that the sphere's weight distribution created the illusion of intentional motion. And that explanation makes sense, because small variations in surface can produce unexpected movement, especially with a smooth, heavy object. But then there were the reports of direction changes, movements that didn't follow a single slope. And that's where the uncertainty remained, because observation can be influenced. Expectation can shape perception. And when something appears unusual, it becomes easier to see patterns that may not actually be there. But even with that considered, the object itself remained. A metal sphere, unusual in its construction, difficult to explain in terms of origin, and then it was examined more closely. Tests were conducted. The material was identified as stainless steel, relatively ordinary, not unknown, and eventually, a more grounded explanation emerged, that the sphere may have been an industrial object, possibly a ball valve, a component used in machinery, designed to be smooth, heavy, durable. And if that's the case, then its presence in that location could be explained. Lost, discarded, moved over time, ending up where it was found. And the behavior? A combination of factors: surface variation, momentum, perception, together creating the impression of something more, and that explanation resolves most of the mystery. But not all of it, because even with a logical origin, the experience remains. The way it moved, the way it responded, the way it felt, different. And sometimes that's enough to keep a story alive, because not all mysteries exist in the object itself. Some exist in the moment of discovery, in how something is observed, interpreted, remembered, and over time, those moments become stories, retold, re-examined, and sometimes changed. But at the center of it, there is still the sphere, simple, solid, unmarked, and quietly resting, exactly where it was found, or somewhere else now, no longer moving, but still remembered as something that once did. The stone calendar in the desert. In the western desert of Egypt, far from the Nile and far from the monuments most people associate with ancient history, there is a place where the land appears almost empty, flat, dry, silent. Nothing about it suggests complexity. Nothing suggests construction. And yet, beneath that quiet surface, there is a pattern, a circle of stones, not large, not towering, easy to miss unless you know where to look. This is Napta Playa. And at first glance, it doesn't seem comparable to the great structures of Egypt. No pyramids, no temples, just stones placed in the sand. But the moment you look closer, the arrangement begins to matter. The stones are not scattered. They are positioned, deliberately, forming a circle with internal alignments that don't appear random. And that's where the meaning begins to shift. Because when the sun rises during the summer solstice, the light aligns with specific stones in the circle. Not perfectly in a modern measured sense, but clearly enough to be intentional, which suggests something important. This place was not built randomly. It was built with awareness of the sky, of movement, of time. And that realization changes how the site is understood. Because Napta Playa dates back to around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, which places it long before the pyramids, long before large-scale monumental architecture in Egypt. And yet, even at that early stage, there is evidence of astronomical alignment that suggests observation, repeated, careful, because tracking the movement of the sun requires time, years, generations possibly, watching where it rises, noticing the shift, recognizing patterns, and then translating that knowledge into stone. That's not accidental, that's intention. But there's more, because Napta Playa was not always a desert. Thousands of years ago, this region was different, wetter. Seasonal rains created temporary lakes, grasslands supported animals. People moved through the area, not permanently settled, but returning, following water, following cycles. And that detail matters, because in a landscape like that, understanding time becomes essential. Knowing when the rains will come, knowing when they will leave, because survival depends on it. And that may be what this structure represents. A way to track change, a way to mark the moment when the environment shifts from dry to alive and back again. But even with that explanation, there are details that remain unclear, because the site is not just a simple circle. There are additional stones, alignments that extend beyond the central formation. Some researchers have suggested connections to star patterns, possibly linking the arrangement to constellations. But these interpretations are debated, not fully agreed upon, because the evidence is subtle, and interpretation can vary. But the core idea remains. This was not random placement, it was design. And then there's the scale of effort, because even small stones require movement, positioning, adjustment, and in an environment like this, that effort is intentional. It serves a purpose, otherwise it wouldn't be done. And then there's the question of continuity, because sites like Napta Playa suggest something about early human understanding, that long before large civilizations formed, there was already awareness of cycles, of patterns, of the relationship between earth and sky. And that awareness didn't begin suddenly. It developed, gradually, through observation, through need, and through repetition, which means places like this are not isolated. They are part of a process, early steps toward something larger, toward the structured calendars, the aligned temples, the monumental architecture that would come later. And maybe that's what makes this site significant, not its size, but its timing, because it shows that the idea existed early. The idea that time could be tracked, that the sky could be understood, and that this understanding could be fixed into the ground, made visible, stable, reliable. And then, over time, the environment changed again. The rains became less frequent, the lakes disappeared, the land returned to desert, and the people moved on, leaving the stones behind. And that leaves something quiet, because the structure remains, partially buried, partially exposed, still aligned, still marking something, even if no one is there to observe it. And maybe that's the final detail, because the stones don't need people to function. The sun still rises. The alignment still happens. The cycle continues, exactly as it did thousands of years ago. And the structure remains, not as a monument to power, but as a record of observation, of awareness, of a moment when people began to understand that time could be seen. If you knew where to look, the massive stones of Balbeck. In the Bkia Valley of modern-day Lebanon, there is a platform built from stones so large that they seem to belong to a different scale of construction entirely. Not slightly larger, not unusually heavy, but massive. The site is known as Balbeck, and while the towering Roman columns above often draw attention first, it is the foundation beneath them that raises the deeper questions. Because within that foundation are 3 stones placed side by side, each one enormous. Known as the Trilobite, at first it is difficult to understand their size. Standing near them, there is no immediate reference point that makes sense. They appear like part of the landscape itself, as if they were always there. But they were moved. Each stone weighs around 800 tons, carved, transported, lifted, and positioned with precision, and that changes everything. Because moving a stone of that size is not a simple extension of moving a smaller one. It's a different problem entirely. The nearby quarry reveals even more. A partially cut block remains there, even larger than those used in the structure. Estimates suggest it could weigh over 1,000 tons, possibly more, which means the builders were not only capable of handling massive stones, they were attempting even larger ones. And that raises the first real question. How? The Roman explanation is often applied here. That Roman engineers, known for their skill, constructed the platform using advanced techniques for their time. Levers, rollers, ramps, large coordinated labor forces, and the Romans were capable builders. But there's a complication. Because some researchers believe the Trilithon predates the Roman structures above it, that the foundation may have existed before the temple complex was built. And if that's the case, the question shifts, because now it's not just about Roman engineering, it's about something earlier, something less clearly understood. Even with ramps and rollers, moving stones of this size requires coordination at a level that is difficult to fully reconstruct. The ground must support the weight. The movement must be controlled. Any imbalance could stop the process entirely, and then there's the lifting. Because placing the stones into position is another challenge. They are not simply on the ground. They are elevated, aligned with other blocks, fitted tightly. That requires precision, not just strength. And then there's the question of why, because using stones this large is not necessary. Smaller blocks could achieve the same structural purpose. Easier to move, easier to place. But that choice was not made. Instead, the largest possible stones were selected, repeatedly, which suggests intention, because scale in construction is always a decision. And here, the decision was extreme. Some suggest that the size was symbolic, a display of power, an expression of capability, something meant to be seen and understood as extraordinary. And that aligns with many ancient structures, but even then, the method remains, because creating something symbolic still requires execution. And execution at this level is difficult to explain in simple terms. There are also theories involving lost techniques, methods of moving heavy objects that are no longer used, knowledge that existed but was not preserved, and over time disappeared. Because history does not always retain every process, it retains results. And this is one of them. Then there are more unconventional ideas, suggestions that the stones were moved using methods we don't fully understand, that the builders had access to techniques that don't appear in surviving records. These ideas are often debated because they move beyond what can be directly proven, but they exist because the scale invites them. And then there's the experience of the site itself. Standing near Trilithon, the stones don't just feel large, they feel excessive, as if their size goes beyond what is necessary, beyond what is practical, and into something else, something deliberate, something meant to endure, because these stones have remained in place for centuries, unaffected by time in ways that smaller structures are not, stable, unmoving, and still aligned, which suggests that whatever method was used, it worked, and it worked well enough to last, and maybe that's the most important detail, because while the process is uncertain, the result is not. The stones are there, placed, exact, and still holding the structure above them, long after the people who moved them are gone. And that leaves the question open, not just how they were moved, but how that knowledge was understood at the time. Because something like this is not accidental. It is planned, executed, completed, and then left behind. As a result, without a clear process, a structure without a full explanation, and a reminder that sometimes the past contains methods we no longer fully see, only the outcome, still standing, still in place, and still difficult to explain.